Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. Today, we're talking about Beef, the 10-episode series starring Yeun and Wong that Netflix released earlier this year. And I'm happy to be joined by returning guests. First, costume designer Helen Huang. Welcome back.
Thank you, Sid.
Also joining us is assistant costume designer Wittick. Nice to see you again, Austin.
You too. Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm glad to have you guys both here. We had mentioned this as something that was coming out, I think, the last time you guys were on the show, and finally we can talk about it. A warning for listeners, today's conversation may contain spoilers. Let's start with when you got involved with the project. Helen, why don't you lead us off?
I got involved in the project because I had asked my agents for a specific, Asian-led project, or with the showrunner or director being Asian. I just really wanted to do something like that. And so they brought me this series, and when I read it, I was just so impressed. And I knew Lee Sun-jin's work. We call him Sunny on the show. He did the second season of Dave. And I knew that, on top of having really good taste, his writing's just very special in a way where it's very relatable and grounded and specific, but it has this sort of philosophical quality to it. And when I read Beef, it didn't disappoint. It had all those things that were so attractive. And so we had a meeting, and and I was just very excited to sort of express all these things that was kind of bottled up inside that I really wanted to express with a show like this.
I think it's noteworthy to mention that, again, on the surface, you might think we've got an escalating sort of revenge tit for tat story that could unfold. But to your point, there's a lot of depth, not just to these two main characters, but the supporting cast really fleshed out in a way that is not obvious on the one-line summary of the show.
Yeah.
And so I can see sort of the interest in bringing these characters to life. Austin, what about you? What got you involved?
I mean, Helen had told me about it after she had interviewed, and I think most of the time with Helen, not most of the time, all the time, she has such a good barometer for projects. And so I follow her lead on it because she knows when she sees good writing. She knows when she sees good stories, when she sees something that will kind of, I think, galvanize a lot of people and will, create a following behind it. And so I really just follow her lead. And this one, like all of them, has done wonderful. It is amazing to see kind of how successful it has been and how people have been so invested in the story. Yeah, it's great.
Taking a step back to the beginning, then, Helen, what is your approach to costuming these characters specifically?
For me, I think I have been, since the beginning, I started costuming, Asian characters don't get there's a scarcity, and they're usually day players on a show. And so with day players, you can't really explore a character that much because they're there to serve a purpose and a story purpose at that. And so day players are a lot more literal. And I always had problems with it because there's so many things that I want to express in terms of sort of different Asian American cultures and, Asian American regional cultures, especially in California, that I didn't get to do. And the show kind of let me do all of it. I think that was a big part of the appeal. And also, for me, when I was reading the story, I was thinking about just sort of economic differences between these characters and regional differences between these characters, which I feel when people discuss people's ethnicity and perspective, they don't really go into that because, you're talking about sort of bigger topics. But for me, to break down a show like this and to break down character like this, you really have to think about sort of upbringing and economic background of Amy versus upbringing and economic background at the present for him.
For Danny compared to Amy as far as their backgrounds.
Yeah. And so that was sort of the starting point, is how do we flesh out sort of these two worlds where, even all the sub characters like George, Amy's husband, or Paul, Danny's brother, how they kind of revolve and how these worlds look when they kind of clash together. And so for Danny's world, I used a lot of, I mean, at Danny's world, I felt like I really knew him because he felt a lot like, you know, like my dad and my uncles and, you know, my brothers and, you know, my friends when I was growing up in the valley, in the San Gabriel Valley. And so I knew that character very intimately and how he should feel. And with Amy, you know, Austin did a lot of research with me where we tried to look at a lot of people who are on Instagram a lot, who brand themselves through Instagram and what that would look like. Because to me, that really exemplified Amy as a person.
I think it's echoing back to what Helen was saying about the day player portion of it. We got 10 episodes in this, and I feel like that was such a great amount of time to give Allie and Steven like a great arc and to actually see them as characters and like a more encompassing kind of depiction of like a human experience as opposed to the day player, you know, like the accessory. Like,
I think accessory is a really good word.
People are they're just tossed in there and you don't get any backstory, you don't get any nuances of culture. It's just, they're just tossed in there. And so to have a show like this where you got to see the both of them from start to finish.
Yeah.
So many points where they're at home, they're out and about. Like you just get to see, I think, a lot more of the small things that you just don't get to see very often with Asian American characters. And so, yeah.
And, you know, we did a lot of research just because when we approached all these characters, because it was very important for us to really portray people in a way where others recognize them. So for Danny, I really want the men that I grew up with to see themselves reflected in his character on screen. With Amy, also to see people and feel like they know people like her. You know, even with Fumi and George, we were talking about how these characters can look more internationally Asian instead of like more locally like Asian American or like even regionally to California Asians. So there was like a lot of breakdown of worlds and trying to like really be truthful to what we're doing. And again, like I think we looked at every blogger out there, right, Austin, for a lot of this.
Did. And I will say, I think it's also makes a big difference when you have somebody like Sunny, where this is his life and this is like his lived experience and his perspective, not even perspective, like it's his existence. And to have Sunny write it and to hear these words from him and get his like viewpoints on everything versus somebody where this is not their lived experience, I think makes such a vast difference just because there's some things you will never know unless.
Yeah, there's such a shorthand. Was like we were talking about Structure, how when he grew up he was do you remember the store Structure, Skid?
It does vaguely, yes.
Yes. So all the boys that are Steven and Sunny's age, and if you live sort of like in the valley or something, you just shop at Structure. And he even had like a Structure belt, you know, that he donated to the show so that Steven can wear. It's just things like that. Like Grace, the production designer, she was like, oh, there's a specific like table that's in all the Korean houses. And like they would have that in his apartment. So it was a lot of like very shared experience and like nuances that we put in there, like Easter eggs for people to be like, oh, I remember that as I grow up, which I feel is like very important on a project like this, is because you sort of want to tear down the monolith that's like Asian American identity, you know, into something more specific. But then you want these like very, very specific things as if to like bear witness to people's experiences, you know, which they've never seen on screen. They've never seen themselves reflected on screen.
To your point, captured in a way that is lived in. I'm reminded of past conversations where when we were talking about doing period pieces, just because it's the 80s doesn't mean everyone is wearing clothes from the 80s. Just because these are Asian households doesn't mean that you're throwing in a lot of Asian stuff. It's got to be more nuanced than that, I'm imagining.
Yeah, it's like, you know, what kind of slippers that they wear, you know, what kind of t-shirts do they wear in the house? Like the items themselves are not specific Asian items. I think it comes from like a lot of different immigrant experiences, you know, and things that parents sort of gravitates towards. And even if you look at like things like clothes and furniture, like relics, you know, it's because they buy these things at the supermarket that they go to, or the small stores that they shop at. With Danny, we took care to give him like a Liz Claiborne. The jacket that he wears throughout the movie is like a really old thrifted Liz Claiborne that we found, because I remember my dad would go to the flea markets and he would be like, oh, Liz Claiborne, that's fancy. And he would like buy it. But, he can't buy that brand from Macy's. It's like too expensive for him. So like him as an immigrant would go to a flea market and like buy this jacket. And it's just something I vividly remember that I feel like I could bring to this character because it's an experience that my father had. Not that Danny is an immigrant or he has an immigrant experience. It's just sort of the accumulation of all these decision-making and life experiences of people.
I think the show gave a lot of things context within the Asian American experience that perhaps a lot of the times other shows, when they're like just day players or accessories and whatnot, they pick out like just tropes. But I feel like this,
you could dive deep.
yes, I feel like it gave so much more of a context to maybe those things you see like once thrown in somewhere. You get a history of why those things exist, what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
There was one aspect of the series that got a lot of attention, and I want to know how costume design ties in. And that is the Amy Lau's character. She changes her hair. It's very obvious. It's actually played as a plot point. I'm curious, when you read that this is going to happen, the hair is going to get that kind of attention. What does that mean for costume?
I feel very conflicted about this too, because especially with women, a lot of times, like when people write scripts, there's usually like a drastic change. So they'll ask for them to have like new wardrobe or like a hair change or something. And for me, my usual impulse with this is let's not have costume follow it, because I don't like, for me, it's like a TV show thing that people do or a movie thing. It's like not a real life thing. Like people don't just buy all these new things just because they're going through this. They might buy one or two. Getting the haircut is actually kind of more valid than all their wardrobe sort of changing, And so I don't really like that. And I also don't really like what it says about women, that we're just kind of like on a whim, we would just like uproot our whole entire identity, especially with someone like Amy, who's like already super aesthetically very sure of herself. Like she knows who she is. She knows the image that she's projecting. She's very smart when it like comes to that. Like, I just don't think that she would let herself become a different person just because she's going through something emotional. What we did, however, is something that we discussed with Sunny in the very beginning, was also because her palette was white and creams in the beginning, because we really wanted to do something surreal with her character and sort of like contrast her emotional state, is that when we hit sort of when she starts cutting her hair, we did give her clothes that are a little bit more colorful. So like all the silhouettes are the same, all the brands are the same brands that we had put her in. It's just that she would wear blue, or she would wear, like a graphic, or, so it would just be something that she would wear green, but the clothes are still the same clothes that she would wear. It's just that the color would be brighter. But just for that small period in the very middle where things are really out of control. And then after that, we took her back to her beiges and her creams. And so that was something that was discussed in the very beginning. But that was also something that I was comfortable with, It is sort of how we operate. It's just like we don't really like to go with normal women.
Small shifts. Because like I was saying, it's not really natural for somebody to just like wake up and be like, oh, today a new haircut, a whole new wardrobe, like practical in terms of like economically, you're just going out and you're spending all this money randomly when you just woke up and felt like it. So like smaller shifts, I think, to incorporate this stuff with the hair felt much more her, as opposed to, something drastic.
I also don't really like when it's like a written plot point to make over a woman. I always find that really insulting. Like, let's stop making over women in TV and movies.
Because it makes it seem like it could be like a lack of confidence or like a lack of unsureness in oneself, but she's very sure. She's a very confident character, like that first scene of her driving, that's a confident person.
That is not a wallflower.
No, that is not a wallflower.
Well, talk to me about some of your other favorite costumes, whether it's a specific character and what you designed for them, or just sort of scenes where there were maybe our extra characters or other aspects of it that you found enjoyable from the costume perspective.
I think my favorite thing maybe one of my favorite things was the big club scene.
Yeah.
Things that take more research and more diving into, again, like the nuances and like the subtle things within different cultures is really fascinating and fun to learn about that. And so going in and like doing research on different clubs around town, different clubs around K-Town, and seeing like what people wear.
We did a lot of Instagram stalking on Korean nightclubs in K-Town.
And it's so much fun because especially with Instagram, you're looking at like real people. You know, you're not looking
Yeah.
at necessarily like ads or editorials. Like you're looking at like what's your group of kids going to wear to the club on a Thursday night?
ABGs and Asian baby girls, and
Yes.
you know what the Korean guys wear to the club. It's really funny because on the day, on the day of the Korean club, we actually had a lot of non-Koreans as background, and they just did not get the memo on how this
Wow.
is supposed to look. I actually was stuck at home with because I was quarantined for COVID because I was in contact with someone with COVID. And Austin was dressing people on set, and he was just like, "Why do all these people look like they're going to Whole Foods?"
I think it really shows how important like everybody to be on the same page of getting the right people to be in this club. And if it was full of white people, it just does not fulfill the mission of the scene.
Because I think they had the description, because it's like, you know, Korean men do wear, like when you write it down, it's like they're wearing t-shirts and in, you know, jeans and stuff. And but it's like very specific things. And so like when you just read it, that's why I think people came looking like they were going to Whole Foods because they just like didn't know what that aesthetic like was.
Doesn't translate unless they
It
have like
doesn't like,
that.
yeah.
But Austin, how do you recover from that on the day?
It was the worst day of his life.
You focus really well on the people who actually are supposed to be there. And so you make sure that they're dressed great. And then you kind of just communicate to the ADs to be like, look,
There's only 25 people. These
yes,
25 people. Keep shooting these 25 people.
you called in 100 people, those other 75 do not exist. Do not shoot them, do not involve them. They should just be little heads bobbing in the background. These 25 people should around Steve in the club. They should be like in front of the camera, but like to just communicate that, because otherwise they'll just throw in whoever and it does not.
Yeah, I actually had to text Sunny and I was like, look, Sunny, there's not enough Asians going to this Asian club. I think you need to come down and see the background. And so he came down and like personally picked out who gets to be in the scene. They like threw in like their personal assistants, like any Asian they could find, they threw it in the club. And then that's why it's shot the way it does, where people in the background were really kind of fuzzy, is because of the issues of the day. But I just thought that was like really funny, where what people need to wear for the scene is so specific that, again, it's like a lived experience. Like unless you really study like Instagram or pictures or reference pictures, you would just like not know how to come dressed, you know?
Now, you mentioned these Asian baby girls, and I'm not quite sure that I picked those out. Does that describe something specifically as far as how you wanted people to look?
ABGs are kind of like, actually, Skid, I am not sure I could actually explain it. But what are some of the style aspects of ABGs, Austin? Big hoops,
Big hoops,
no patterns.
some great heels. Remember like heeled booties or like thigh highs? I feel like we put some
Thigh highs,
put some thigh
short
highs.
skirts, or like good denim, crop tops.
Yes, good denim shorts.
It's just something you have to look at, because they also, like, the hair is very specific, the makeup is very specific. But it was something that everyone was really excited about dressing. But it's really hard to explain. And I think like what we're having at this moment of trying to explain these things, it's harder because when you say it's like very simple things, but they're very specific, simple things.
Can you cast for the sense that people would self-identify and show up correctly, or you had to sort of manipulate it?
We had two featured ABGs, and they were like, when they came to the fittings, they had like bags and bags of clothes. It was like amazing. And they dressed themselves and they were like, this is what I would wear to the club. And I was like, you are amazing.
I will say 2 points to this. One, I think this whole situation does kind of paint the picture of like lived experience great, because one of the girls I was helping to fit and I didn't get very much. And then Helen stepped in and was like, oh, wait, no, actually, this is how it should be. And I was like, I can only go so far with the research. And then Helen's like, actually, I think these other things kind of like make it much more authentic, or like, I think it painted the picture better. And I also think all of this proves a good point of how important costumes is, because there are certain words that
Yeah, you can't describe it.
you can't describe this. Like, we could go, I'm sure, back and forth about this all day to find words, and I don't think anything would paint the picture as importantly and accurately as having the physical pieces there in person and putting it together in such a like authentic and honest way to where like words would not be able to get you that same image, if that makes sense.
Which is why I think sometimes, like, you know, when people talk about representation below the line, that's the important part, is the the non-verbal understanding of how something should look like, whether it's hair, whether it's clothes, even production design. It's just, you need more voices that have many different experiences. And it's very important when you have a project to get people who sort of understand what the aesthetic outcome should be,
The words can only take us so far, I think, in terms of visual description.
Yeah. I really loved Steven's club outfit because we did his club outfit like when I used to club. And that was very different than what people club now. We thrifted all his clothes, by the way. We did Costume House and thrifted all his clothes. So Allie was like, we scoured the internet and bought her all this like beautiful, expensive things. And then Steven was like, Goodwill. And so like for the club scene, we were like, oh, he hasn't been to a club in a really long time. So this happens a lot with like Steven's character, Danny. It's like, he doesn't have a point of reference. Him as a person like doesn't grow in terms of like aesthetics, like I really view him as a guy that stopped trying to dress himself around 25, and then everything else that he's wearing is sort of like a memory of what things should look like. If he needs a new pair of shorts, he would buy a pair of shorts to replace that pair of shorts. He's not the type that's like, let me be up on this season's newest clothes, And so when we dressed him for the club, it was like what guys wore to clubs, like basically in the early 2000s, So he wore like a black shirt with like a white V-neck under, the structure belt, square toe shoes. It was all of that. When he went to church, he wore like a cornflower blue shirt that was like extremely popular in the late 90s and like extremely like JCPenney looking, but like JCPenney from like 1998. And so it was like those small details. That's why his outfits to me was like very special, because it was like little time capsules. Obviously, like Fumi and George were like super fun to dress, but I can't pick an outfit from there because they were so fun.
Maybe it's not even an outfit for Fumi. I would say that with Fumi, it was a great like process with her.
Fumi's the character that's Amy's mother-in-law.
Yes. And when we first started out with her, it felt like a more kind of dead-on literal approach with Comme des Garçons and Junior Watanabe. And then I feel like on our second and third round with her, it got to be more natural when you're starting to put in other labels, and we were playing around with more, I think, like shapes and different ways to style it, as opposed to what we were first looking at, which was, just one label head to toe.
I think that's why like the show is really important, because like if you're a day player with someone like Fumi, you get like 1 or 2 fittings, with Patty, with Fumi, we did like 6 before we like really nailed it down, but like sometimes you need 6 fittings to get like a very specific person. And I think that's the luxury of doing a show like this, is like you get to really play with the characters, and really get them right. I think in the end, she wore a lot of vintage Issey Miyake, and it softened her up for the character that Sunny wanted. But yeah, I think, again, it's like when you have a show like this with so many Asian American characters, you could really like take your time and work with them. So you get the most nuanced version of the character instead of like the first read of a character.
And because they're in multiple episodes, subtleties that you set will reinforce over time, rather than just making as you said, this accessory appearance in and out, and having to make a quick impression. There's just more time for all of these supported characters to realize. Obviously, a lot of subtle and important work to bring this show to life. It's also getting great reviews, and so congratulations to both of you, and really appreciate you guys breaking it down for us. On that note, we'll call it a wrap.
Great being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us today.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info on our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media, so check it out. Now, where are we going to see you guys next? I know there's a writer's strike going on. Last time you mentioned you guys were working on the Penguin.
We're still working on the Penguin. We're paused because of the writer's strike, but hopefully we'll get right back into it.
You know where you better come talk about it. All right, I will be watching for that. My closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.